On this episode of China Unscripted, Taiwan is not prepared for a Chinese invasion. And if they're looking to the U.S. for help, they're looking in the wrong place. Welcome to China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Zhang.
And I'm Matt Gnezda.
And joining us today is Michael Hunzeker. He's an associate professor at George Mason University. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. Michael, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, everyone's always like, oh, when is China going to invade Taiwan? And there's a whole bunch of dates that get thrown around, but nobody really knows for sure.
All right, I definitely heard it was 2027.
2027. It's definitely 2027.
I also heard 2023.
Or 2025?
It's when you least expect it. But so I think the better question is, what should we be looking for as a sign that an invasion is imminent?
Well, I guess the way I would answer that is, it strikes me, if I were she, which I am clearly not, I would do everything in my power to make sure that if the invasion were imminent, that wouldn't be telegraphed far in advance. And so this is, I think, one of the challenges, and something I've been working on for a number of years, is this idea that Taiwan, and maybe to a lesser degree Washington, really have bought into this idea that we will have early warning indicators months, maybe even years in advance. And that would be nice if it's true, but I don't know that we should organize all of our planning and our mindset around that. Rather, we should expect to be surprised, and our plans should be in place so that if that is indeed what happens, we're ready for it.
Maybe have a aircraft carrier strike group just permanently stationed in the area.
Well, I mean, we could agree to disagree on the utility of an aircraft carrier in that scenario, because I think either way it becomes a coral reef pretty quickly. But in my mind, really the key is to make sure that Taiwan is ready, because chances are, for all sorts of reasons, we're going to have to surge into theater. So what I've really been trying to focus on is what can we do to inoculate Taiwan against surprise so that it can hold the door open for the U.S. to show up when and if this happens.
I definitely want to talk about that, but just go back to the idea about like early warning. Wouldn't there still be, like, China has to move troops? Like, we would see that, right?
For sure, there will be indicators, but I think if we have learned one thing, certainly from the ongoing war in the Middle East, it's the fact that strategic surprise is still possible. And in particular, and this kind of ties back into Taiwanese sort of mental and cultural readiness for a worst case scenario, China does have options such that it might be able to get some sort of a running start. Yes, we might be able to detect some of these indicators, but some of those indicators may themselves be ambiguous. So we could think about major exercises where you've slowly but surely been stockpiling munitions and moving people into place, and that big exercise, maybe you've done a few of these things and it kind of lulls people into a sense of complacency. And then you could start from an exercise in a way that would make it much more difficult. Again, difficult if you're not prepared.
Right. So looking at how, for example, Russia invaded Ukraine, they'd been doing, training exercises along the border, totally innocuous. And there were a lot of people were at the time writing, oh, there's no way Russia's going to actually invade Ukraine, because that would be silly. That hasn't happened in a few years.
A few years. Okay. Yeah.
No, and this is the boiling frog approach that I think concerns some of us. This idea that if you hold enough of these big joint sword exercises and you do this for some number of months or years, you're just going to play into this this sense of complacency that largely exists in Taiwan, but to some degree also in Washington. That this is just the Chinese. They're just rattling the saber again. We know that Xi really wants to win without fighting, as though there's anyone in the world who wants to fight without winning. And then suddenly that morphs into something else. We would be lucky, I think, if Xi finds himself in a position that Putin did, and he gives us months and months and months and months of early warning indicators, and maybe does something like Putin did in Crimea, where he grabs some offshore island years in advance, giving us plenty of warning about his true intentions and giving Taiwan the alarm bell that, hey, you need to take this thing seriously. But again, I would like to plan for a worst case scenario, not a best case scenario. And the worst case scenario is, of course, that Xi has learned something from Putin.
So what would the worst case scenario actually look like?
So in my estimation, the worst case scenario is an all-out invasion, but an all-out invasion in which we've had this kind of steady drumbeat for some long period of time that has just lulled us all into thinking, it's never really going to happen. And then one that is at the earliest stages, sort of a shock and awe type campaign where we do see a lot of rapid movement. We see long range missile strikes. But I think the nightmare scenario that really keeps me up at, well, night, because it's a nightmare, is that she has already managed to put a lot of stuff on Formosa. And the idea that if he has some sizable footprint already on the island, some fifth column, some units, special forces that he can activate, combined then with things that he can insert in the earliest phases of a conflict, I think Taiwan and the Ministry of National Defense have so convinced the Taiwanese people that the only way China could invade is a World War II D-Day style invasion across the Taiwan Strait, and that Taiwan's military is ready to make sure that no Chinese boots ever actually hit the ground, hit the beach, that just the idea of missile strikes combined with PLA forces that are already on the island in the earliest phases might be too much for the Taiwanese people and the Taiwanese leadership to withstand.
How big is the PLA's fifth column, do you estimate?
No idea. And again, this comes back to my idea that defense establishments, they exist to plan for the worst case scenario. Whatever that worst case scenario is, I hope that that's the one that we're organizing around. My fear is that we have this caricatured idea that there'll really be no interference behind friendly lines, that there will be months and months and months of early warning, and that basically we can just flock all of our defensive capabilities to the beaches, looking over the iron sights, waiting for them to come across the Taiwan Strait. I would agree at the end of the day, the bulk of the occupation force will have to come over the Taiwan Strait, but my guess is that Xi will do everything he can to erode and undermine resistance from within before he mounts that phase of the campaign.
My understanding is that's how the successful takeover of Hinan Island happened in, was it 49 or 50 when the CCP took that from the nationalists?
Yeah, I think it does not take a leap of strategic creativity to see that if you were in Xi's shoes, you're really going to try to undermine defenses, both physically but also mentally, before you actually mount the main phase of the invasion. And I think the best historical analogy I can think of, the one that really concerns me the most, is actually France in 1940. This idea that on paper, it looked like a pretty capable organization. Taiwan's Ministry of National Defense, on paper, looks like a pretty capable organization. But when the German attack looked nothing like what the French prepared for, you just see this cognitive implosion, the sort of dominoes quickly collapsing in on itself. And then an organization which actually really still had the wherewithal to fight kind of gave up in a matter of weeks.
So you think the enemies may already be inside the gate. How do you defend against that? Like, I can see why you say an aircraft carrier is not useful, and that's kind of a situation.
So this is why, I and several others have been really arguing for a whole of society defense, because that really gives you two things. And I can go into the technical details of what I mean. But in essence, yes, an active duty military force that's sizable and capable and well trained and well equipped. Yes, a reserve force that can be mobilized quickly. And Taiwan's reserve force cannot be mobilized quickly. And that can be mobilized under fire, because almost assuredly, if the full invasion's coming, it's going to be, prefaced with long range strikes, cyber and kinetic. But I think all of this has to have a backstop. And that backstop, in my estimation, needs to come from what, by lack of a better term, we would call a territorial defense force. This idea of young men and women in Taiwan who haven't necessarily joined the formal active duty military, but who have still received a level of combat training. They are organized and prepared to defend their homes, because I think this really does two things for you. First, it actually prepares you so that if there are fifth columns, if there are boots already on the ground, or even if those things don't happen, if the PLA manages to make a lodgment, which I think is reasonable to assess that they will, there is an ability to defend in depth. And again, we're talking in the cities and the streets and the homes. The second piece, though, which I think is almost more important to the physical ability to be able to repel these sorts of incursions and intrusions, is just the mental and cognitive wherewithal to just have faith and confidence that, yes, I am capable of defending my neighborhood, I am capable of defending my family, that this is not a fool's errand, and that we can resist for as long as we need to, the key being need to in order to hold the door open for U.S. forces to arrive.
It seems like the key to that is that young Taiwanese men and women need to be aware that that this is a threat, and they have to start taking action now to get the kind of training they need to be able to handle this kind of a situation. But what is the public sentiment in Taiwan about a Chinese invasion? Do they care? Do they think it's going to happen? Do they take it seriously?
The short answer is no. And, I say this having so I have been back and forth to Taiwan 20 some times in the last 20 some years. I was involved with training Taiwanese Marines 20 years ago. That's kind of how I first began to dabble in this issue. And I just spent the last month in Taipei. And really my focus there was not to do research by meeting with high level officials, because we kind of already know what they're going to say, but rather I just to hang around people, talk to young people, talk to cabbies, to really get a pulse on the zeitgeist, for lack of a better term. And I think, if I'm just being blunt, the Taiwanese people don't take the threat terribly seriously. And there's certainly a segment of the population that does. I don't think that reflects a mainstream view. And again, I don't put the responsibility for this blasé attitude on the Taiwanese people. There are a lot of folks, I think, in Washington who will say, like, the Taiwanese don't want to fight, they're weak-kneed, they don't have the resolve. I don't think that's true at all. I think Taiwanese young men and women are as able and willing to fight as American young men and women, as Ukrainian young men and women. I think the key difference comes from military leadership and political leadership. And for all sorts of very complicated reasons I don't myself fully understand, I think the political leadership in Taiwan has definitely made a calculated bet that the threat isn't real, or at least that the threat can be forestalled long enough, or that if the threat does manifest, there's nothing Taiwan can do, so the U.S. will have to do the heavy lifting anyway. And so it is politically expedient not to raise the alarm, but rather to focus on, dinner table type issues of the sort that concern voters everywhere. And the result then, I think, is just this almost what I would call willing ignorance, complacency from the political class to say one thing to Washington, which, even just today with the announcement of the new Taiwanese defense budget is, we're taking this seriously. But then if you actually look at what they're telling the Taiwanese people, even the Ministry of National Defense acts as though an invasion isn't a real threat, right? The real threat of these gray zone incursions or cyber attacks, or indeed the sorts of things that actually couldn't lead to Taiwan's annexation.
That seems surprising to me, because I could imagine something like that maybe under the KMT that was more friendly towards China, looking to do more engagement. But the DPP has been in power for a while now, and they seem to understand that there is a threat. So I'm surprised, like, what's happening with the military or the political military class, that they're not communicating the threat seriously.
I guess I would offer a slightly different interpretation of the DPP. I think the DPP is very attuned to Washington's threat perception. I think the DPP is very good about telling Washington what Washington wants to hear. And so when they hear about the Davidson window, they know that this is what's keeping Washington up at night. So they say, we take the Davidson window very seriously. I think they are also astute enough to know American history, to know that we kind of take things at face value when our allies and partners say things, then we go and focus on other problems, rather than looking at, okay, well, you've said the right things, but now are you doing the right things? Talk is cheap, action is costly. And it's on the action front that, and I've done a lot of this in writing, so nothing new here. I think the Tsai administration and now the Lai administration have been disingenuous. And so they say the right things to Washington, but when it really, push comes to shove, and push comes to shove means forcing change on an otherwise reluctant, tradition-bound, conservative-looking military organization. In that respect, Taiwan's military is no different than any other. Taiwan's military is not taking the threat seriously. Taiwan's military is not realistically preparing for war. Yet the political class, which has been in charge for 8 going on 9 years now, has really done nothing that is necessary to overcome that bureaucratic resistance, to really call on the Taiwanese people to sacrifice, and to really push the Taiwanese people to take the threat seriously. And again, I think there are 2 simple political calculusi, whatever the plural of calculus is.
Calculises.
The calculon, the 2 calculon going on, I think, are 1, fighting the Ministry of National Defense, which is KMT leading. It's going to be costly, it's going to be nasty, and there are all sorts of challenges in doing so. And number 2, I think President Tsai and President Lai both recognize that to really sound the alarm bells to the Taiwanese people is to open themselves up to the KMT critique that they themselves have created the tensions that necessitate this sort of urgent action. And so I think there's sort of this calculus of, well, I'll tell Washington what they want to hear so that I can increase the odds that Washington will show up on our behalf. Meanwhile, we'll kind of, roll the dice here at home, politically and domestically, because that would cost us in the short term in an electoral sense if we really did everything we needed to do.
Now, you wrote a chapter in The Boiling Moat and we had Matt Pottinger on, who was the editor of that book. But in your chapter, you talk about how the Ministry of National Defense is plagued by corruption and espionage cases. That sounds serious. Like, how bad is this, and like, what's happening there?
It is serious. I am a simple, humble academic, so I have no access to the classified realm. My hope is that our intelligence capabilities have a better pulse on it. But I will simply put it to you this way. Hardly a week goes by, even in the English language Taiwanese media, in which you don't find some scandal being rocked about some former military officer, some retired general or flag officer who has been wined and dined by the Chinese. That would lead me to believe it is more probable than not that the same thing is going on in the active duty force. So that's a big problem. There's also simply the problem that we do know that the KMT has people who just fundamentally the KMT leaning military officer corps, not all of them, but some of them certainly just don't take the threat seriously. So there are those who are being wined and dined and maybe be colluding with the Chinese. There are those who just don't think the Chinese would ever attack. That's just not the way things would play out, so they don't take the threat seriously. And so I think you add those two problems together, that's a big issue. Totally separate from that, or maybe also related to some degree, is this corruption problem. And again, any military is going to have some degree of corruption, but I think it is much more significant than what we would find in the US in terms of just kind of the kickbacks that happen, the skimming off of the top. I have heard anecdotal stories about, senior military officers taking money that's been set aside for the food budget for the troops and skimming a little bit off the top to make sure that, they can have a better living. And if you start to compound all of these problems together, again, it suggests a military that is less focused on war fighting and more focused on, making sure that it's taking care of itself.
What is the military culture in Taiwan? Like, how do civilians view the military? Like, is it considered, America, the whole thing about, like, thank you for your service? Like, is there that kind of attitude towards the military? I'm asking also because I know in China, the attitude toward the PLA is kind of, you don't want to go into the army unless you have absolutely, essentially no choice. So people don't respect the military.
Yeah, so I would say that the popular cultural attitude towards the military is very similar to what you would find in China. And, that's not surprising. Culturally, this idea that you don't use good iron for nails, you don't use good young men and women to serve in the military. I think that basic challenge, though, is compounded in a few different ways. The first is just unabashedly, the military in Taiwan has an authoritarian legacy. It was a big piece of the authoritarian regime and martial law and enforcing martial law through the 1980s. And so for older Taiwanese, this legacy is still alive and well. And in particular, for those who identify on the pan-green side of the political spectrum, the DPP, this is going to be a real problem and a real reason not to trust the military. I also think at the political level, many of the senior DPP political leaders, because they have so little trust in the military, it also means they have very little exposure to the military. And that, as we could talk about later, makes oversight very difficult. So that's one piece of the problem on top of just the basic cultural, like we shouldn't, serve in the military unless you have no other choice. The other problem, I think, is even among younger Taiwanese, those who would have no living memory of authoritarian rule, there is just this profound sense that the military is a waste of time. And again, that isn't a relic of culture per se. I think it is literally a waste of time because in their lives, right, conscription has been shortened and shortened and shortened, and everybody knows someone who has served. And those who have served, and I actually saw this firsthand when I was training Taiwanese Marines 20-some years ago, the conscript's time is just utterly not valued. And so you'll find conscripts doing things like mowing lawns and painting walls and standing guard duty. What they aren't doing is realistic and rigorous training. Arguably, you probably get more realistic training from Call of Duty than you do from serving 4 and now 12 months in the military.
I heard in some cases they don't even handle guns.
So it sounds like they've at least overcome that problem. But yes, now
Okay.
we Washington are applauding them because now their conscripts will fire something like 28 rounds in their tour of service, and that's an absurdly low number. Certainly barely enough just to know what end of the weapon the bullet's going to come out of. So the Taiwanese know this. This kind of gets back to the Taiwanese youth, and they're sort of like, let me do everything I possibly can to either avoid military service, or if I have to serve, and this is a big problem too, let me make sure I'm not serving in a combat unit. And so they're doing everything they can to get to a cush desk job. Again, it's not because they're afraid to fight per se, but they're like, listen, if I'm not going to be trained on how to do this, then what I want to do is set myself up for success, do my time, maybe learn a skill or two I can take to the civilian sector and move on with my life.
What is the conscription like? What is that requirement now in Taiwan? You said it's 12 months?
So they are transitioning, and that's the key operative word. So up until 2022, it had been reduced to 4 months. So a long time ago, it was like 2 years, and they slowly reduced it, especially in the Ma years. And then in the last few years, it had been 4 months. And everyone recognized that was just grossly insufficient to do any sort of realistic training. In December of 2022, President Tsai made this big, much heralded announcement that they're going to move to 1-year conscription. But the key is that was going to be a gradual transition. And so right now it's a mixed force. There are some number of the majority of people who still are conscripted, who still serve for 4 months. There is a small percentage who have begun the 1-year tour of service. And right now, I think this year that's about 9,000. But the full 1-year scheme, in other words, everybody who's going to be conscripted is going to serve for a full year. That's not going to actually come to full speed until I think 2029. So by 2029, everybody who's conscripted will serve 12 months.
And what percentage of the Taiwanese population gets conscripted?
So right now it is supposed to be all young men born, I forget after what year they would be eligible for this. And after 2029, everyone who is conscripted will be serving the year. I don't know the percentages in terms of those who are eligible versus those who actually wind up serving. I do know it is fairly easy to either find a way to get an exemption from service, either because you need to go to school or you have flat feet or something along those lines. Or even if you are conscripted, to make sure that you manage to find your way into a non-combat unit billet.
It sounds to me like there are several other Asian countries that have much more rigorous conscription, like South Korea or even Singapore, that are not directly facing a threat from the Chinese Communist Party the same way that Taiwan is.
Yeah, and I think this comes back to one of these puzzles that we can only solve by looking to political leadership. Because again, Taiwan is, I think, unambiguously, we can debate about the date of an invasion or if an invasion will occur, but unambiguously faces a greater threat than probably South Korea, Singapore, or any of the other countries that have more rigorous training and conscription schemes. And yet, just the response has been so blasé. So yeah, so what? Show me something I didn't already know. And again, I don't think we can solve that problem without really putting pressure on the political class to make the change, both in terms of pushing for change on top of the Ministry of National Defense, but also in alerting the Taiwanese people that this threat really it's serious.
What is the civilian gun culture in Taiwan?
Somewhere approximating 0. So I live in Texas. I once wrote in an op-ed, Taiwan is no Texas, and there are probably more guns in my neighborhood than there are in the entire island of. So that, again, one of the things that worries me is that after the war in Ukraine, we see a lot of these civil defense efforts pop up. And of course, the media in Taiwan really wants to report back on stories that Washington wants to see, read, click on. And so one of the big stories is, of course, these civil defense things are taking root and really people are energetic about it. And so, especially after the invasion happens in Ukraine, we see lots of stories with pictures of Taiwanese civilians with firearms. Number one, those aren't firearms. Those are airsoft BB guns. They're firing little pellets, so not real firearms. Number two, those pictures, it'd be like finding the 3 people in a park who are training with this thing, taking a picture of it and just focusing in so it looks like there are thousands of people that are doing this, and it's just not the case. So again, there is definitely a vocal and active minority who are taking a lot of these civil defense preparations efforts quite seriously. And people like Enoch Wu, one of my co-authors on that chapter in Boiling Moat, who've really been working for years trying to build up this grassroots support. But it is not the mainstream view. And I think most Taiwanese just kind of look at it. It is kind of weird and quirky that these people are trying to play, Call of Duty, but for real.
Can Taiwanese civilians get guns like the way Americans can?
No. There are quite literally, and I'm sure there are lots of complex reasons, but you cannot as a civilian purchase a firearm. There may be some bizarre exception. There are also no firing ranges. And so this is a double problem. I mean, there are literally no firing ranges for civilians who can't own firearms anyway. but it's also a big problem. There aren't enough ranges, even for the Taiwanese military. And so even if they're starting to ramp up conscription and expand reserve training, they've been running into some real constraints about literally where do you send these people so that they can, put rounds down range.
I mean, that seems like such an easy fix.
If you have the political will, a lot of things become easy when you want to do them.
Well, they should basically just import a bunch of people from Texas.
They could become the kings of Taiwan.
I feel like that might work, but again, I think a lot of these things are not insoluble. They don't take a PhD to figure out. What they do take is a little bit of political willingness to take a little bit of risk and to ask the Taiwanese people to do things they have not yet been asked to do. I think if you ask them and you prepare a realistic way for them to do it, I think the Taiwanese young men and women would be perfectly willing, just like they would in any country that values their democracy and freedom.
I think it's interesting that you bring up this political will thing, because now I'm thinking about Taiwan's COVID response and how they really did this whole of society, like very clear government communication to people about what the risks are and what they wanted the people to do, and how people stepped up themselves to contribute to Taiwan's COVID response and how proud they were of their, and it wasn't coercive the way that the response was inside mainland China, where it's like, you will now be locked inside your home. Even though there were like quarantines for people coming in from out of the country and things like that, people seemed much more willing to deal with it because I think the communication from the health ministry was seen as exemplary. So it seems like Taiwan has the ability to communicate to its civilians on this kind of level.
Oh, absolutely. And this is why I keep coming back. It is not about the willpower of the Taiwanese people. And in some ways, I really feel like the political class underestimates what the Taiwanese people are capable of and sort of infantilizes them. And a prime example, so, I was there in July of this year. At the end of the month, we got hit by a typhoon. It's the second time I've been there for a major typhoon. And I will tell you, I can compare the Taiwanese response and resilience in the face of a threat that they were prepared for, which was to really shrug it off and say, we are ready, nothing surprises us. And then when invariably the flooding and the loss of electrical power happened, like they treated it like it was no big deal and carried on. And I juxtapose that with what happened to Houston, Texas, right before I left, where we got hit by a very small hurricane and it basically brought down the power grid for 5 days, people calling for the governor's head. And so it tells me that this isn't about one culture being superior in the face of adversity to another, but rather it tells me that the Taiwanese people have been mentally and physically prepared for natural disasters. Now it's simply time to take the next step as a political class and say we can also prepare them in order to inoculate them against this sort of invasion threat so that they're ready. The problem would be if they're not ready, if they are caught off guard, if they're caught by surprise. And that's, I think, when you find a society that's willing to give up pretty quickly.
Do you think that it is something that could realistically happen? Like, are there examples of countries or, political classes that are willing to do something like this at a political cost to themselves, like a political cost to the DPP,
Yeah, I mean, so on the political calculus side, it's an interesting question. In terms of have we seen a society galvanize very quickly? Yes, Ukraine. And that is a classic example that, again, Putin did us a favor in air quotes in that he invaded in 2014. And that was a real wake up call that the threat was real and that Ukraine's existing military apparatus was not ready for something more. And so it kind of had 7 years, but they took the threat seriously. And we see a real societal and military and political reorientation. So I know it can happen. Really, if you look at the history of the United States, we are continuously throughout the last 200 years caught off guard. We are not ready. We get ready quickly. The reason I'm concerned, though, is both in Ukraine's case, where Putin does a favor and does like a half-hearted invasion to start things off years ago, or the U.S., where we're thousands of miles away from any direct threat to the homeland. Taiwan's got 90 miles of standoff distance. And again, I think some of that threat will likely already be on the main island by the time this thing happens. So Taiwan won't have the luxury of time, which is why I think left of boom, way left of boom, preferably 5 years ago, but if not 5 years ago today, I really would like to see Washington twist some arms in Taipei and really get the Taiwanese leaders to start, doing what needs to be done, even if it may cost them an election or two.
Well, that's what strikes me about what you're saying. And we make these comparisons between Ukraine and Taiwan. There's also an element here that the U.S. for a long time was kind of covering most of the NATO security budget. And that was a big point of contention between the U.S. and NATO countries. And they were not taking the threat seriously. In many ways, it sounds like that's what's happening with Taiwan, where the U.S. is investing this time and energy and money into Taiwan, and really at the core, the threat is not being taken seriously.
So I think this is an excellent point. Moral hazard, this idea that if you insure somebody, you're only going to make them more likely to engage in the dangerous behavior. I think that is an acute problem in the U.S.-Taiwan relationship. And I think there are several aspects to it, none of which are necessarily super easy to solve, but all of which have to be addressed. On the one hand, I definitely think there's the sense that, listen, the Chinese are never going to really do this. They're our brothers, they're our kindred spirits, and that's just not the way they operate. Another aspect, I think, of the challenge is this idea that the U.S., and let's be honest, whether we're talking post-World War II or the 1970s, we do have a history of throwing Taiwan under the bus. And so there's this deep skepticism and cynicism, I think, even especially among the older generations, that really U.S. arms sales are a form of protection racket. So as long as we buy U.S. weapons, we can just shove the darn things on a shelf. If they want us to buy Harpoon asymmetric weapons, fine, we'll buy them, we'll shove them on a shelf. Really what we're doing is paying protection money and ensuring that the U.S. will come. I worry a great deal that there's a disconnect because the U.S. sees this as, listen, we're giving you weapons to fight for yourself. That gives you the ability to defend yourself. And so they're expecting us to show up, and we're expecting a Ukraine model where we can just send weapons from afar. That could be a real problematic disconnect. And then on the DPP side, my real fear is that I think there is a sense that, listen, we're going to come in and save the day. And I'll be honest, I doubt that Taiwan could withstand a sustained invasion on its own indefinitely. I don't think any military analyst thinks that they could. So yes, the U.S. would need to show up. My fear is that if the DPP doesn't push for its military to take the threat more seriously, I think there's a sense that we're going to show up in a matter of days, maybe a matter of weeks. But as Matt Pottinger and others made clear in Boiling Moat, we actually think that we're going to be talking Taiwan holding out for maybe months or longer. And that even if the U.S. shows up, this war may escalate in directions we don't anticipate. And so the U.S. may find itself distracted and tied down in other theaters as well. And Taiwan may still need to be able to continue some big bulk of the fighting. And to the degree that the DPP thinks really this war will be short, China's going to mobilize. The U.S. is going to see it. The U.S. is going to show up very quickly, and China's going to be thwarted before any boots getting on the deck. Again, my sense is that cognitive mindset, the moment that's dashed, that could be very horrifying for the Taiwanese people, and that's when we should be worried that they just sort of give up.
Well, the CCP's military budget is like upwards of $200 billion a year, right? It's more than the entire national revenue of Taiwan.
Yeah, so their self-admitted budget is $200 billion, but I have seen estimates in the public space, it actually realistically is probably closer to about $700 billion. And yes, if you then compare this to Taiwanese defense spending as recently as 2021, Taiwan was spending about 11 billion US. Just today, they announced they're going to be spending 20 billion US. So, it is a dramatic increase. But if you just look, the Chinese military budget, no matter how you define it, is orders of magnitude larger.
Wow. So the CCP budget could be almost on par with the U.S.
It by some estimates that I've seen, yes, it could be very close to the U.S. And if you just think about the fact that they don't have to pay their soldiers nearly as much as we have to pay ours, they can get a lot more boom for the buck. Now, quality of personnel, quality of equipment, that of course is up to interpretation. But the whole goal here is not to win the war. The goal is to deter Xi from even rolling the dice in the first place.
Right. Now, one of the things you've written a lot about is that Taiwan shouldn't necessarily look to the military model of the United States, but in fact, they might be better off looking at the model of really small countries dealing with really big threats. Countries like Estonia, Lithuania, Ukraine, and most importantly, as you pointed out, Israel. So what ought Taiwan learn from that Israel model?
No, I'd say it's a terrific observation, but I would be self-congratulating. No, I think this is an important point. If I were a super snarky academic, I guess I would probably write an article about the U.S. military support for Taiwan entitled, like, With Friends Like These. I don't know that the U.S. military has been doing Taiwan that many favors over the years. For many years, we were selling them weapon systems that were just not appropriate for the problem set that they faced, and talking about very expensive high-end platforms like F-16s. Then when we train them, of course, we train them in the model that we understand. That makes sense, but that's just not a model that's going to work for Taiwan. Just use one example. For several years, the Taiwanese military said, listen, we want to reorganize our reserve force to look like your reserve force. And in fact, if you talk to people in Taipei, they would even say, we want our reservists to be weekend warriors like your reservists. And I was trying to impress on them, weekend warrior is not a good thing. That's not a term of praise. So some things are lost in translation. But the bottom line, and I say this having served 6 years on active duty and 10 years in the reserves, is the U.S. reserve model, the way it operates today, is predicated on the assumption that you have months and months and months of advance warning. You can activate reserve units. These reserve units have already been training 1 week in a month, 2 weeks a year, and then you give them 3, 5, 6 months of refresher training before you have to send them downrange. There's just absolutely no world in which any realistic invasion unfolds in which Taiwan will be able to mimic that. So it's just got to find a different way of doing things, preferably one that is organized around a kind of fight tonight mentality. And so Israel is obviously a classic example of a force with a relatively small active duty apparatus, a large but very capable reserve apparatus, and both of those are able to integrate and go downrange to fight in short order and under duress. And we just, unfortunately saw that play out a few months ago. Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, well, Estonia, Lithuania, less Latvia, I think are another great example. These are really small military organizations. They have built in or integrated themselves with large territorial defense forces. So this idea of civilians who are volunteered, they're trained, they're ready to augment what the active duty can do. And for Estonia in particular, so small, there's this recognition that, listen, we can't win on our own. But what we can do is make the prospect for a quick military victory so low that it will both deter Russia, but also buy the U.S. and the rest of the NATO allies to the West plenty of time so that they can actually get in there and protect the Estonian people.
Well, I'm curious about something with the Israeli military model. They don't seem to be able to deter attacks. They get attacked basically every 5 to 10 years. Isn't deterrence the main goal of a Taiwan strategy?
No, deterrence. Yes, deterrence is the main goal. But I think this does bring up something which is sometimes glossed over, but speaks to the urgency of the challenge. And that is, then there's research to back this up. Those who are super interested in geeking out should read Jonathan Shimshoni's book, Israel and Conventional Deterrence. And the idea is, unless you're willing and able to go the nuclear deterrence route, and for reasons we can talk about, I don't think that's realistic or something Taiwan should consider. You're stuck with conventional deterrence. The problem with conventional deterrence is, in order for that posture to deter, you got to send signals. You got to tell the other side what you're going to be capable of doing to them. The problem is, when you send those signals, you're giving the other side information about your defense posture. And so provided that the other side has enough time, it will almost always be able to find a way to engineer around your deterrence posture. And so this is why I worry a great deal. In the near term, it's not that hard for the PLA to find a way to engineer around Taiwan's existing defense posture. But even in the longer term, and I've had this conversation with Taiwanese counterparts, I think there's this sense that there's some magic mixture of weapon systems and explicit security agreements from the US that will simply cause China to never be a problem again, that this is a finite problem for a finite duration. And the point I keep trying to impress is this is more likely than not a generational challenge or beyond. This is something that's going to be going on for a really long time. And even if Taiwan embraces what I see as being a more realistic, asymmetric conventional defense posture, at some point in the indefinite future, the Chinese will find a way to engineer around that, and Taiwan's going to have to reorient again. So in my estimation, this is about public willpower. This is about political leadership and a willingness to say we're in it for as long as it possibly takes.
So how did, to go back to Israel, how did Hamas engineer around Israel's defense posture? Because Israel, again, great military, highly trained. They've got the Iron Dome, Hamas surprise attack, and they completely got around it. I mean, obviously they're facing consequences for that, but how did they do that on October 7th?
Yeah, so I think 2 points are in order. The first is that deterrence is always a function of the one you're trying to deter's pain threshold. And if at the end of the day, the side you're trying to deter says, I accept those consequences, I accept this price, you're never going to be able to deter them because they're going to be willing to take that pain. And this is why conventional capabilities usually are never enough on their own. And the nuclear piece ends up having to come into the conversation if you really, really want to have a foolproof way to keep the other side from attacking. The second piece of this, though, speaking to Hamas and a lot of Israel's preparations, and you mentioned Iron Dome, Israel went high end. And my understanding is Iron Dome, high-tech, sophisticated surveillance systems, the ability to intercept communications. It did a great job at the higher ends of the conflict spectrum. But the challenge is it leaves all of these sort of low-grade, low-tech capabilities and ways to plan. People using bulldozers to push over fences, messages that are passed via paper note, not sent over unsecure communication devices. If you leave those abilities open to the other side, then of course they're going to engineer a way to attack that exploits those. And so for Taiwan, I think the lesson is this ability to be prepared for an attack that unfolds in a way that you don't expect, and for China to do things that are going to surprise you.
So there's so much talk about deterring China from invading. Is there a way to take the fight to the CCP, to actually weaken the CCP so they're unable to mount an assault?
Yeah, no, I think this is a very useful thing to bring up. So I always like in my presentations to quote Dr. Richard Bush, former chairman of the American Institute Taiwan, who likes to say cross-strait relations are fundamentally a political problem with a military dimension. And for obvious reasons, we've been very focused on the military dimension. I in particular think we need to, because I don't see a political solution forthcoming, which means the military solution becomes more and more tempting for the other side. But at the end of the day, we are going to, if we're going to avoid war, we're going to have to find a way around this political impasse. By the same token, I think there are ways to put pressure on the CCP, on the Chinese government, on the Chinese people. In order to convince them in the long run, it is better off for them to seek a political solution than a military one. My fear, though, is because the military challenge is so daunting, and as we've discussed, there are so many potential options for Xi that he could use to exploit, that it becomes tempting to think that there is a purely political or purely economic solution, and we can just bypass all this nasty, let's get Taiwan to do all these things Taiwan doesn't want to do. And at least in my estimation, the more pressure we put on the CCP to take the fight to them without making sure that Taiwan is ready for a worst case scenario, the more tempting it becomes actually for Beijing to say, listen, there's the front door, let's just bust right through it to avoid this pressure and solve the problem once and for all. So in my view, we should be exploring every possible creative aspect to put economic and political and diplomatic and cultural and informational pressure on the Chinese government, the CCP. But none of this is going to work, and it may even backfire on us if we are not simultaneously pushing Taiwan to do everything that it can to just make sure that that front door is solidly shut.
Well, besides the U.S. trying to squeeze China, for instance, economically, if they're spending $700 billion on their military, definitely cutting off their access to some of that money could be very useful. But that's still the U.S. taking initiative. Is there anything Taiwan can do to take the initiative?
In my view, I think Taiwan is probably doing about everything that it can. President Tsai had her southbound policy in which she was trying to, number one was don't be economically dependent on Beijing. But that's easier said than done. And to give credit where credit's due, I do think the DPP has made a concerted effort to begin to find new ways to diversify its economic reliance on the region in the United States. That will bear fruit. But in my view, there's probably nothing that Taiwan can do or that the U.S. could push Taiwan to do that would possibly solve this problem short of political capitulation for all sorts of reasons. I don't think that's what Taiwan should be doing and what we should be pressuring Taiwan to do. In my estimation, focusing Taiwan on the one thing that it can do, which is improve its defenses, to give us time in a worst case scenario, that's most likely to deter Xi from trying to exploit a military solution. And some of these larger things, these larger approaches really will fall, I think, quite heavily on Washington. one of the challenges is, of course, I think not just Washington, but our allies around the world and in the region. And that itself could prove trickier because getting Japan and South Korea to change some of their dependency on Chinese markets, again, easier said than done.
What are the things that Washington should be doing to pressure Taiwan, and like what should Washington be getting Taiwan to do?
Sure. So I think there are a few things that Washington should be doing immediately. The first is we should be putting conditions and strings on any aid packages, whether those be FMS sales, FMF grants, or presidential drawdown authorizations. All of those should be structured not as blank checks, but as quid pro quo arrangements, making crystal clear, and maybe this is made public, maybe this is made private. There are arguments for both. Making it clear, though, to the Taiwanese leadership that you're only going to get these things if you are making both the changes we want, but also meaningful progress. Which leads to my second. The U.S. has just got to do a better job of actually monitoring follow through. It is too easy to tell, I think, Washington what it wants to hear, get Washington to just worry about other things. But the nitty gritty follow through, making sure the institutional changes are made, making sure that harpoons aren't just purchased and put on a shelf somewhere or handed off to the B team, that indeed these things are being actively integrated. This is something I think Washington should do a better job of monitoring. In particular, I think a bellwether is whether or not the Ministry of National Defense will articulate and publish a coherent defense concept or doctrine. And so, quick interlude, backstory. Not that long ago, under Admiral Lee Shimin, Taiwan's military actually did unveil a very asymmetric, dynamic, creative, forward-thinking doctrine for defending itself. It was called the Overall Defense Concept. The problem was it was kind of the brainchild of one man and a small cohort of officers around him. And so when he retired, the Ministry of National Defense completely rejected that. And at no point since Admiral Lee left active duty have we seen the Ministry of National Defense approximate anything, number one, close to an asymmetric doctrine, or number two, even a coherent doctrine that treats war as a real possibility. So actually seeing the Ministry of National Defense roll something out and then take the steps to integrate that with its training, with its preparations, with its acquisitions, those I think would be important indicators along those lines. And the third thing is, in the absence of being able to find Taiwan other partners to learn from, I think we got to get more trainers in Taiwan. And even more effective than that is I think we need to get a lot of Taiwanese units here to the United States to train. I think the benefit of getting whole units to train in the U.S. is twofold. Number one, it gets them away from Taiwanese leadership, which means a big piece of training them to fight is to train them to make their own decisions. That's really hard in a top-heavy organization with a lot of generals and admirals running around. So getting them to the United States, getting lower-level leaders in a position, in a place where they can train and they can make mistakes and feel comfortable making mistakes, that's key. And I think number two, if you bring them to the United States, it is less politically contentious because that's not U.S. boots in Taiwan, that's Taiwanese boots over here. And it also kind of keeps them out of the limelight, which should keep the PLA guessing.
All right, so hear me out. We start another war in the Middle East, and we invite Taiwan's troops to come and join us in that fight. Then they get better training that way.
No. Let the man cook.
A bizarro sequel, the Taiwanese straight version of Ender's Game. I would simply point out that there are a couple of wars already going on, and if the Ministry of National Defense were serious, it could be sending people over there to observe them and to learn lessons from them. But my understanding is, at least in Ukraine, there are volunteers from Taiwan going, but there's not a formal established pipeline to do so.
Well, how many Taiwanese volunteers are fighting in Ukraine?
I don't know what the numbers are. I would imagine they're quite small.
So it's not like a Spanish Civil War scenario where like people are just coming from all over, like we're going to fight with the good guys. But
were there good guys in the Spanish Civil War?
No, it was the communists versus the other communists versus it was a mess. Maybe you don't want that.
The better guys. Well, at this point, beggars can't be choosers. I would advocate for anything that gives the Taiwanese military real combat experience to help them see that their sort of sclerotic vision of centralized war from on high is just not going to succeed against anything the Chinese throw at them.
This is the solution. We invade Taiwan.
Well,
as in the United States
Yes.
or this podcast? Okay.
No, we don't have a military, Shelley, obviously. Don't let them know we have a military. No, the United States invades, and then they have to get the experience fighting the U.S. No one would see it coming.
there may be some militias here in the home state of Texas that might be willing to join up for that little...
Texas alone invades Taiwan. Easy. So, now we talk about this a lot on the show, but I think it always bears repeating in the context of everything we've talked about before. What is at stake? What are the consequences for Taiwan, for the United States, for the world if China is successful? Where do I get my semiconductors?
So the stakes, I think, are significant. The United States has very important interests in Taiwan. I guess I would quibble with some who say we have unlimited interests. And in other words, it's worth kind of everything we could possibly do to defend Taiwan, which is why I think it is important to signal to Taiwan, you are important, but you're not everything. We wouldn't want to survive without you, but we could if we had to, which means it really is incumbent on you to do everything you can to defend yourself. So you make the good case to the American people that this is a fight worth fighting, and it's a fight that's actually possible to win. But I think there are a few key pieces. The first is, it's a democracy. It is not a democracy by accident, but it is a democracy that's self-democratized, despite the fact that we threw it under the bus. And I don't even want to begin to imagine the ramifications. We are already in a moment in history where democracy is on its heels. And if the United States were to simply allow Taiwan to be absorbed coercively by China, thereby extinguishing a very important example of Sinic democracy, I think that would reverberate quite loudly. Yes, there are economic implications. I don't want to hang too much importance on the economic side because I think economies can adapt. It would be very costly to do so. I also worry a bit about going too far down the semiconductor argument because I think in a crisis situation, the semiconductor becomes a hostage. And if the semiconductor industry is a hostage, it really then turns on a balance of resolve. And if I were to assess American willingness to go without Taiwanese semiconductors against Chinese willingness to go without semiconductors, I think I know which side is going to blink first. And so I would hate to allow Beijing to put us in a position where it's holding a gun to the semiconductor industry's head and saying, go ahead, I'll pull the trigger because Beijing might do it. And we might be the ones to say, you know what, we're going to back down. I think another key piece of this is the potential for reputational trickle-down effects or knockdown effects. And by that, I mean Japan and South Korea and Australia, and to a lesser degree, Europe, are going to be watching what we do and what we don't do in a Taiwan Strait crisis very closely. Now, I don't want to go so far as to say if we were to abandon Taiwan in a moment of crisis, that is the end of the liberal international order. I don't think it's quite that simple. But I definitely think there are missteps and mistakes the United States could make, especially with loose talk in the earliest stages of a crisis. And whatever decision that we make, people are going to be watching around the world, and they're going to infer from that something about our willingness to intervene or to not intervene on their behalf. But the most important consequence is if a war happens in the Taiwan Strait because we were unsuccessful at deterring China and we have to fight, we simply have to understand that there is a risk, number one, that we win, but we win a Pyrrhic victory, or number two, that we lose. Which is why I like to keep coming back and saying deterrence is worth literally any price, because every other possible outcome short of Xi Jinping just immediately being raptured and this whole problem going away is decidedly worse off for the U.S. and for Taiwan.
You think he's going to go up, not down?
As a non-religious man, I am not willing to place a bet on where he goes. If you were to go somewhere, well, even there, it might be wishful thinking that the whole Taiwan Strait problem goes along with him.
Well, that is a good question. The CCP is, at the end of the day, the fundamental problem. And China right now is beset by some pretty unprecedented economic and political challenges. Is there a possibility that it'll just resolve itself?
I think that I would say more likely than not that war doesn't happen. I don't think that war is an inevitability. I don't even know that I'd say, it's 51% likely. What concerns me is that, of course, way more likely than I would be comfortable with, both as a veteran, as somebody who's married to an active duty service member, and someone who just cares about global stability. And so in my mind, again, the idea is let's just do everything we can to enhance Taiwan's defenses. Let's do everything we can to show China that we are actually serious about security and stability in the Indo-Pacific. And then hopefully that combined with the economic and political and cultural headwinds that Xi faces, are just going to convince him, like Pottinger likes to say, you know what, let me come back and I'll revisit this another day.
So always push it off to the next day.
Let's try to get Xi Jinping to procrastinate for as long as possible. Is that the?
Let's give him an excuse. Let's give him an excuse.
We should get him addicted to TikTok.
He's just doom scrolling and forgets to launch an invasion.
Yeah, his attention span becomes trash. Can't focus. We've come up with great ideas. America invades. God, no one would expect that. And then the semiconductors would be ours.
The real problem is we haven't figured out a way to profit from those wonderful ideas. And that's why you should never be interviewing professors. We're just really bad at that.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. I mean, profit, war for oil, war for semiconductors.
That's true.
So for people watching this program around the world, and they're, obviously some of them are going to be worried about an invasion and all the consequences of that. What is it that ordinary people can do?
Should we mail Taiwanese citizens guns?
I feel like there are so many ways that could probably go sideways on us if we were to try that attempt. I would say first and foremost is just paying attention to the problem set and being an informed voter or citizen, because it has probably become easy to sort of just tune this stuff out. Taiwan, most dangerous place in the world headlines. Maybe those were shocking a few years ago, but at a certain point that can lull even Western voters into a false sense of complacency. I would say for those who are really interested in the issue, certainly studying up on it, but also reaching out to representatives on the Hill would be useful, because one of the challenges I have heard from talking to those who do work on these issues on the Washington side of things is that there's this sense, I try to make the case, we need to be willing to twist some arms. Yes, they are our friends, but good friends tell each other unpalatable truths, like you got something between your teeth. And in this case, Taiwan has something really big between their teeth. There is a reluctance, I think, on the Hill and in this administration right now to really play hardball with our friends and partners. And I get it that more often than not, you don't want to do that sort of thing. But I think that the stakes are sufficient and the threat is realistic enough that this is a time for sort of unprecedented action. And so to the degree that those watching are willing to reach out the next time they have a conversation, send an email to one of the representatives or senators saying, this is something I take seriously. It would have serious ramifications for the American people if she were to go ahead and gamble on war. It is in our interest for you to have those tough conversations, so that the next time a congressional delegation goes to Taiwan, they're not just there to eat the baozi and everything else, but rather to ask some really hard questions and maybe behind closed doors to make it clear what our expectations are and that we're going to be paying close attention.
What about Taiwanese people? What can they do outside of the government stepping up?
Yeah, so I would say there are two big things. The bigger ask is for people to join these civil defense grassroots organizations, and there are a lot of them out there right now: Polar North, Kum Academy, and Forward Alliance by Inaku. Each of these organizations has a slightly different approach to the problem set. In my mind, let's not let perfect be the enemy of good. Getting more Taiwanese to sign up for these training courses will mentally prepare them, but it's also going to send a signal to Beijing and to Washington that the Taiwanese people are serious, even if their government hasn't yet caught up. The easier ask, because obviously joining a civil defense organization, that's time and expense, would be to take steps at home to prepare yourself for a worst case scenario. And I have heard there have been some U.S. government folks in Taiwan who have said things like prepare like you would for a natural disaster, a typhoon or an earthquake. And I don't think that's great advice, because number one, a typhoon and earthquake is a short duration event, maybe a couple of minutes, a couple of hours, a couple of days. And number two, generally speaking, these natural disasters only hit one part of Taiwan at a time. And I think what we really need to do is to push people to think about what would you do if there were a full-scale invasion and the central government becomes necessarily fixated on mobilizing the military and making sure it's ready to fight. And how are you going to get water? How are you going to get food? Because none of these things may be getting through for a prolonged period of time, and you won't be able to turn to the government for that support. So mentally preparing and literally doing a little bit of reasonable stockpiling, they don't have to become full-on preppers, maybe just light preppers, I think would definitely go a long way to helping out. And the final piece is, of course, for the Taiwanese people who take this seriously, to push their political leaders to make this a serious effort.
All good advice. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is very insightful.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation. And, like I said, hope springs eternal. I think these are solvable problems, but it is my sense we might be running out of time. So we should get moving.
And I definitely recommend anyone watching check out Boiling Moat. It's fantastic. But also, if anyone watching would like to follow you, know more about what you do, where should they go?
You can join my mother in following me on X or Twitter, whatever we call it now. I think it's at Michael Hunzeker. You can also find me on the George Mason University website. And I've, like I said, been writing quite a bit on this issue for some time. And so if you're interested, would always love to have a great conversation online or over the phone if these are things that you find important enough to talk about.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
It was occurring to me as Michael was talking this last bit about what Taiwanese people can do themselves. And earlier I was kind of praising the Taiwanese government's COVID response and how well they communicated to people. But then I realized if your government is like too competent, then you can kind of start to rely on them to tell you what to do, right? And the idea that if there's an invasion from the CCP, that like everything may just go to hell, and then
they won't be there.
The central government won't be there to be like, hey, like this is what you need to do. You know what I mean? Then that's actually a detrimental effect of having a good government.
So really, Taiwan should be looking to Ukraine, which the government, they're being so corrupt and beset by various problems that they literally elected a guy who was a, TV show president to be the actual president. And now look at the level of resistance in Ukraine from the ground up.
I was going to say they should look to the U.S. Like we hate the government. We have lots of guns because we don't believe that somebody's going to save us. We have to save ourselves. That's Calvinism. Actually, that's not Calvinism.
That's Texanism.
Yeah. Calvinism is the opposite of we have to save ourselves.
Yeah, I was going to say, where did the Calvinism thing suddenly come from?
Yeah, that was wrong. My point is, if you're listening, Taiwan, buy guns, learn how to use them. Don't trust the government.
Build a bunker. Like, where are you going with this?
Don't send your kids to school. Tinfoil hats, very important. Wear them all the time.
I feel like this has gone off the rails now.
Yeah. But no, it is amazing. Like the gun culture. Like I can't imagine being in a country where there is a legitimate fear that you will be invaded, and like you wouldn't be like, oh, maybe I should know how to shoot a gun.
I think that was Michael's point, right? That there is this
it's just
idea
not gonna happen.
that it's never going to happen because it hasn't happened so far, and there have been times when like the threat seemed much more real, like in the 70s or the 60s, 50s. So now it's kind of like you're in this like lull of thinking, okay, it's never going to happen.
So real now, like with the constant increasing incursions and military drills, just seems more likely than ever.
None of that has gotten to the point where anybody's actually, I mean, this is terrible to say, but nobody's died. You know what I mean?
Well, it's a boiling frog situation, as Michael pointed out.
Boiling frog in a boiling moat.
Well, it's not a boiling moat, unfortunately. To go by Matt Pottinger's definition, is that we need to make the moat boiling so that no one can cross it. But what's actually happening
I think your idea then was then we have
boiling.
to set the Taiwan Strait on fire, is what you said during the podcast.
But like these increasing, training drills and increasingly sending the PLA Air Force over the median line of the Taiwan Strait, and it's just like, getting used to it. And at some point, one of those could just turn into the actual invasion. And, the Taiwan Air Force response, they're exhausted. They're like, out for repairs, whatever it is. And then boom. So the point is Taiwanese people need guns.
Yeah, even if you never have to deal with the Chinese invasion, shooting a gun is cool. It's fun. You've done it, Shelley.
Yeah, I was actually trying to calculate if I've shot as many rounds as a trainee, as a conscript in the Taiwanese military. I mean, I might be close,
Yeah.
actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I've only been to I fired guns 3 times in my life, which, again, may be more than conscripts in the Taiwanese military, which is a
Sadly.
little scary to think about.
So yeah, Taiwan, if Shelley can shoot a gun, you can shoot a gun. And you better watch out. Because America's coming. We're going to invade. We're going to take all your semiconductors. Because that's how it works.
Have you ever been to Texas, Chris?
I have not. I should.
We should all go to Texas together.
I'm a little worried about if Chris is like this now, what will happen after he goes to Texas?
Did you know I was born on a mountaintop in Tennessee? I killed me a bear when I was only 3.
Wow.
I'm an American.
Chris Chappell.
This went off the rails. Thanks for watching China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Chong.
And I'm Matt Ganejda.
Talk to you next time.